Behind the golden gates of Valdemar Palace, where crown jewels glitter and ancient traditions reign supreme, a family crisis threatens to destroy the very foundation of the kingdom. When King Edmund makes the most devastating decision of his reign, cutting all ties with his beloved Queen Isidora's family, the palace walls that once echoed with laughter now tremble with whispered secrets and broken hearts. This is not just another royal scandal. This is the story of how love, power, and betrayal can tear apart even the strongest bonds, leaving a queen questioning everything she once believed about loyalty, family, and the crown she wears. What happens when the woman who gave up everything for love discovers that love might not be enough to save the people she holds most dear? The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdemar Palace as Queen Isidora made her way through the corridors she had walked for 15 years as the kingdom's beloved monarch. Today felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the way the servants averted their eyes when she passed, or how her personal secretary had stumbled over simple words during their morning briefing. Something was stirring in the palace, and Isidora's intuition, honed by years of navigating royal politics, told her it wasn't good news. Isidora had always prided herself on being more than just a ceremonial queen. When she married King Edmund at 23, she brought with her not only grace and intelligence, but also a deep love for her family that had shaped every decision she made. Her younger brother Marcus worked as the palace's cultural advisor, her sister Elena served as the head of royal charities, and her aging parents lived comfortably in a wing of the palace, enjoying their golden years surrounded by their grandchildren and the luxury that came with their daughter's position. The Ravencrest family had not always been wealthy. Isidora's father had been a respected but modest university professor, and her mother a talented artist whose paintings now hung in the palace galleries. When Isidora caught King Edmund's eye at a cultural festival, she was working as a museum curator, passionate about preserving the kingdom's heritage. Their love story had been the stuff of fairy tales, with Edmund choosing love over political alliance, much to his advisor's dismay. But fairy tales, as Isidora was beginning to learn, don't always have happy endings. The first sign of trouble came during what should have been a routine morning meeting with Edmund in his private study. Usually, these meetings were filled with warm conversation about state affairs, family matters, and their shared vision for the kingdom's future. Edmund would often pull her close after discussing serious matters, reminding her why their partnership worked so well both personally and politically. Today, however, Edmund sat rigidly behind his mahogany desk, his usually warm brown eyes cold and distant. The morning lights streaming through the tall windows seemed to create a barrier between them, and Isidora felt an unfamiliar chill settle in her stomach as she took her usual seat across from him. "Edmund, you seem troubled," she said softly, reaching across the desk to touch his hand. "What's weighing on your mind?" He pulled his hand away, and that simple gesture felt like a physical blow. Edmund had never rejected her touch before, not in all their years together. "Isidora, we need to discuss some changes that need to be made regarding your family's position in the palace." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isidora felt her heart skip a beat, then begin racing as she processed what he might mean. Changes? What kind of changes? Edmund stood and walked to the window, his back to her as he spoke. "The Royal Council has raised concerns about the influence your family has within the palace walls. There have been suggestions that perhaps it's time for them to establish their own lives outside of court." Isidora rose from her chair, her legs suddenly feeling unsteady. "Suggestions from whom?" "Edmund, my family has served this kingdom faithfully. Marcus has revolutionized our cultural programs. Elena has raised millions for charity, and my parents. Your parents are not the issue," Edmund interrupted, still not turning to face her. "But Marcus and Elena's positions have become problematic." The room seemed to spin around Isidora as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Problematic how? They've done nothing but serve you and this kingdom with dedication and love." Finally, Edmund turned around, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. It was the face of a king, not a husband. Cold, calculating, and completely closed off from the woman who had shared his bed and his dreams for over a decade. "There have been allegations, Isidora. Serious allegations about financial impropriety and abuse of power." The words hit her like physical blows. "Allegations from whom? Show me the evidence. Let me speak to whoever is making these claims." "That's not how this works," Edmund said firmly. "The Royal Council has reviewed the matter and made their recommendation. I've decided to accept it." Isadora felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. In all their years together, Edmund had never made a major decision without consulting her. They had always been partners, always worked through problems together. You've decided? Without even discussing it with me first. Some decisions are too important to be influenced by personal feelings, he replied, and each word felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of their marriage. The conversation that followed was a blur of accusations, denials, and increasingly desperate pleas from Isadora for her husband to reconsider. She demanded to see the evidence, to know who was behind these allegations, to understand why everything was happening so suddenly. But Edmund remained stone-faced and unmovable, as if he had already grieved the decision and moved past any emotional attachment to it. As the meeting concluded with Edmund's firm declaration that her family had 1 week to make arrangements for their departure from the palace, Isadora felt something inside her break. It wasn't just her heart, though that was certainly shattered. It was her faith in the man she had loved and trusted above all others. Walking back to her chambers felt like moving through a nightmare. The palace she had called home for 15 years suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Every portrait of previous monarchs seemed to be judging her. Every servant who bowed as she passed felt like they were mocking her powerlessness. When she reached her private sitting room, Isadora collapsed into her favorite armchair, the one Edmund had surprised her with on their 5th wedding anniversary, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Her family, who had given up their own lives to support her role as queen, were being cast out based on mysterious allegations that no one would explain or substantiate. But perhaps what hurt most was the realization that the man she thought she knew better than anyone had become a stranger. The Edmund who had once promised that her family would always have a place in their lives, who had welcomed them into the palace with genuine warmth and appreciation, had somehow transformed into someone willing to destroy them without even the courtesy of a proper explanation. As the afternoon wore on, Isadora found herself staring out at the palace gardens where she had spent countless happy hours with her nieces and nephews, teaching them about the flowers and planning family picnics. Those gardens would soon be off limits to them, just another part of their lives that would be ripped away by a decision made in secret by people who had never bothered to know them as individuals. The woman who had once felt like the luckiest person in the kingdom now felt utterly alone, trapped in a golden cage with a man she no longer recognized, and facing the impossible task of choosing between the crown she had worn with pride and the family who had supported her journey to wearing it. As evening fell over Valdemar Palace, Queen Isadora sat in the growing darkness of her chambers, wondering if this was how royal fairy tales really ended, not with true love conquering all, but with power and politics crushing everything beautiful and pure in their path. The next morning brought no relief from the nightmare that had begun the day before. Isadora awoke to find that Edmund had already left their shared bedroom before dawn, something that had never happened in all their years of marriage. The emptiness of the space beside her felt symbolic of the growing chasm between them, and she realized with a sick feeling that he was avoiding her deliberately. As she prepared for the day, Isadora's hands shook while fastening her jewelry. These pieces had been wedding gifts from Edmund, each one carefully chosen to represent their love and partnership. Now they felt like chains, beautiful but binding her to a role that was becoming more prison than privilege. Her first stop was to find Marcus, who was in his office reviewing proposals for the upcoming cultural festival. When she entered, his face lit up with the warm smile that had always been her anchor during difficult times. Isadora, perfect timing. I wanted to show you the preliminary designs for the autumn exhibition. The artists have outdone themselves this year, and I think. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her expression. What's wrong? The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other as Isadora tried to explain the impossible situation. Marcus listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with each detail. When she finished, he sank into his chair as if the weight of the news had physically knocked him down. But why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What have we done to deserve this? I've dedicated my life to serving this kingdom, to supporting you and Edmund. The cultural programs have never been more successful. Isadora sat across from her brother, seeing her own confusion and pain reflected in his eyes. I don't know. He mentioned allegations of financial impropriety and abuse of power, but he wouldn't show me any evidence or tell me who made these claims. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she remembered from their childhood when he was trying to solve a difficult problem. Financial impropriety? Every penny that goes through the cultural department is accounted for. I have receipts, bank statements, approval forms for every expenditure. My books are cleaner than most government agencies. I know that, and deep down, Edmund knows that too, which makes this even more bewildering. They sat in heavy silence for several minutes before Marcus spoke again. What about Elena? Have you told her yet? The thought of having to break this news to her sister made Isadora feel physically ill. Elena had always been the most sensitive of the siblings, wearing her heart on her sleeve and believing wholeheartedly in the goodness of people. This betrayal would devastate her in ways that might never fully heal. Finding Elena required a trip to the children's hospital in the capital, where she was overseeing the installation of a new playground funded by the Royal Charity Foundation. Isadora watched from a distance as her sister laughed with the children, her face glowing with the pure joy that came from making a difference in young lives. The sight made what she had to do even more heartbreaking. When Elena saw Isadora approaching, her smile faltered immediately. She had always been able to read her older sister's moods, and the gravity of Isadora's expression was unmistakable. "Children, I need to speak with Her Majesty for a few minutes," Elena said gently, guiding them toward the nursing staff before walking over to where Isadora stood under a large oak tree. "It's about the family, isn't it?" Elena said without preamble. "I heard whispers in the palace this morning, servants talking in hushed tones and stopping when they saw me." Isadora took her sister's hands in hers and felt them trembling. As she explained the situation, she watched Elena's face transform from confusion to disbelief to a deep, wounding sadness that seemed to age her by years in the span of minutes. "But the charity work," Elena whispered. "We're in the middle of 3 major fundraising campaigns. The Children's Cancer Wing expansion, the literacy program for rural schools, the disaster relief fund. How can I just abandon all of that?" "You're not abandoning anything," Isadora said firmly. "This is being done to you, not by you." Elena began to cry then, not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh, broken sobs of someone whose faith in the world had been shattered. "I trusted him, Isadora. When you married Edmund, I believed we were joining a family that would protect and value us. I turned down marriage proposals, career opportunities in other countries, because I thought I had found my purpose here." The pain in her sister's voice cut through Isadora like a blade. Elena had indeed sacrificed potential romantic relationships and career advancement to serve the crown, believing that her work was not just meaningful but appreciated. To discover that it could all be taken away based on faceless accusations felt like the cruelest betrayal of all. That evening, Isadora requested a private dinner with Edmund, hoping that away from the formality of his office, she might be able to reach the man she had fallen in love with. She dressed carefully in the blue silk dress he had always said brought out her eyes, and arranged for their meal to be served in the small dining room where they had shared so many intimate conversations over the years. When Edmund arrived, he was still wearing the mask of cold formality that had become his default expression around her. He sat across the candlelit table as if she were a foreign diplomat rather than his wife of 15 years. "Edmund," she began carefully, "I've spoken with Marcus and Elena today. They're devastated. And honestly, so am I. Can we please talk about this properly? As husband and wife, not as king and queen." He cut into his meal with precise movements, not meeting her eyes. "There's nothing to discuss, Isadora. The decision has been made. But it doesn't have to be final. If there are concerns about their performance or conduct, we can address them. We can implement oversight, change their responsibilities, anything but this complete banishment." Finally, Edmund looked up at her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of the man she had married. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Some mistakes can't be corrected," he said simply. "Some trust, once broken, can never be repaired." "What trust?" Isadora demanded, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "Show me what they've done. Give me specific examples of these alleged crimes. Let me see the evidence that convinced you to destroy my family." Edmund set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "The evidence exists, and it's compelling enough for the Royal Council to recommend immediate action. That should be sufficient for you." The Royal Council. Isadora felt a chill run down her spine as she thought about the 5 men who served as Edmund's primary advisors. Lord Chancellor Morrison, a traditional man who had never hidden his disapproval of the influence Isadora's family held in the palace. Defense Minister Blackwood, whose military background made him suspicious of anyone he couldn't control. Treasury Secretary Hamilton, who viewed every expenditure as a personal attack on the kingdom's finances. "Which members of the council?" she asked quietly. It was unanimous. Edmund replied, and something in his tone suggested that this conversation was over. As they finished their meal in heavy silence, Isadora found herself studying the man across from her, as if seeing him for the first time. Where had the Edmund gone who used to seek her counsel on important decisions? When had he stopped trusting her judgment enough to at least explain his reasoning? Later that night, as she lay in bed listening to Edmund's steady breathing beside her, Isadora realized that whatever was happening to her family was just the beginning. The man who could cut ties with people who had served him faithfully for over a decade was capable of making other ruthless decisions as well. She thought about her parents, who would be heartbroken to leave the only home they had known in their golden years. She thought about Marcus, whose work had brought international recognition to the kingdom's cultural heritage. She thought about Elena, whose charitable efforts had improved countless lives. And she thought about herself, about whether a marriage could survive when one partner was willing to destroy everything the other held dear without explanation or remorse. As dawn approached, Queen Isadora made a decision that would change everything. She would not simply accept this decree. She would fight for her family, even if it meant going to war with her own husband. The decision to fight back came with a clarity that surprised Isadora. She had spent her entire reign as queen trying to be the perfect supportive wife, the gracious public figure who never rocked the boat or challenged the established order. But watching her family's lives be destroyed by faceless accusations had awakened something fierce and protective within her that she hadn't known existed. Her first step was to do what Edmund had refused to do: investigate the allegations herself. If there was real evidence of wrongdoing, she needed to see it. If there wasn't, she needed to understand who was behind this conspiracy and why they wanted her family destroyed. Isadora began with the palace's financial records, using her access as queen to review the accounts managed by both Marcus and Elena. She spent hours poring over budget reports, expenditure statements, and audit findings. What she discovered was the opposite of what the allegations suggested. Both of her siblings had been remarkably careful with their spending, often coming in under budget and documenting every expense with meticulous detail. Marcus's cultural department showed a consistent pattern of successful programs that brought in tourism revenue while staying within their allocated funds. Elena's charity work had administrative costs that were actually lower than the industry standard, with an impressive percentage of donations going directly to the intended recipients. Armed with this information, Isadora requested a meeting with Lord Chancellor Morrison, the most senior member of the Royal Council, and the man she suspected was behind the allegations. Morrison was old-school nobility, the kind of man who believed that commoners who married into royalty should be grateful for the privilege and never ask for more. The meeting took place in Morrison's ornate office, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors who had served various monarchs over the centuries. He greeted Isadora with the perfunctory respect required by protocol, but his distaste for having to explain himself to her was palpable. "Your Majesty," he began before she could speak, "I understand this situation is difficult for you personally, but the crown must be protected from any appearance of impropriety." "Appearance?" Isadora repeated, setting the financial documents on his desk. "I've reviewed the accounts, Lord Morrison. There is no impropriety, not even the appearance of it. So I'll ask you directly, what evidence do you have that my brother and sister have done anything wrong?" Morrison glanced at the documents, but didn't pick them up. The concerns go beyond simple financial matters. There are questions about influence peddling, about using their positions for personal gain, about creating conflicts of interest that could embarrass the crown. "Specific examples," Isadora demanded. "I want names, dates, specific incidents. Not vague accusations, but actual evidence." For the first time since she had entered his office, Morrison looked uncomfortable. He shuffled some papers on his desk and cleared his throat several times before responding. "The nature of the evidence is such that revealing it publicly could compromise ongoing investigations." "Ongoing investigations by whom? What agency? What department? Who is conducting these investigations? And why wasn't I informed that members of my family were under scrutiny?" Morrison's discomfort grew more obvious. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, your emotional attachment to your family members makes it inappropriate for you to be involved in these matters." The condescension in his tone ignited something dangerous in Isadora. This man was dismissing her as if she were a child rather than a queen who had served the kingdom faithfully for 15 years. "My emotional attachment? Lord Morrison, my emotional attachment doesn't prevent me from recognizing that destroying innocent people without evidence is wrong." She stood up, gathering the financial documents. I want to see every piece of evidence the council used to make this recommendation. I want to know who provided information about my family members, and I want to review the investigation methods used to verify those claims. Morrison also stood, his face flushing red. Your Majesty, you're overstepping your bounds. The Royal Council serves at His Majesty's pleasure, and our deliberations are confidential. And I am His Majesty's wife and partner, Isadora shot back. If you're making recommendations that affect my family, I have every right to understand the basis for those recommendations. The meeting ended in a stalemate, but Isadora had learned something valuable. Morrison was hiding something. His refusal to provide specifics, his discomfort with her questions, and his immediate resort to protocol and hierarchy suggested that the evidence against her family was either non-existent or fabricated. Her next step was more dangerous, but necessary. She decided to approach other members of the palace staff who might have insights into what was really happening behind the scenes. This required careful maneuvering, as she couldn't be seen as undermining her husband's authority or creating divisions within the palace. She started with Margaret, her personal secretary who had worked in the palace for over 20 years and had a reputation for discretion and loyalty. During what appeared to be a routine scheduling meeting, Isadora carefully probed for information about recent changes in palace dynamics. Margaret, you've been here longer than almost anyone. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Changes in how departments are operating? New tensions between staff members? Margaret hesitated, clearly torn between her loyalty to Isadora and her fear of getting involved in palace politics. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Your Majesty, there have been some private meetings in recent weeks. Lord Morrison has been meeting with certain staff members, asking questions about your family's activities. Some people have been uncomfortable with the nature of his inquiries. What kind of questions? Personal questions. About their spending habits, their social connections outside the palace, their political opinions. Things that seem designed to find problems rather than assess performance. Isadora felt a chill of recognition. This sounded like a witch hunt, not a legitimate investigation. Has anyone been pressured to provide negative information? Margaret looked around nervously before answering. I've heard rumors that some junior staff members have been told their jobs might be in jeopardy if they couldn't provide useful information about potential misconduct. The picture that was emerging was deeply disturbing. It appeared that Lord Morrison had conducted what amounted to a campaign to find dirt on her family members, using intimidation and fear to pressure staff into providing ammunition for his predetermined conclusion. That evening, Isadora made a decision that she knew could be seen as treasonous. She decided to bypass the Royal Council entirely and take her findings directly to trusted advisors outside the palace. If Edmund wouldn't listen to reason from his wife, perhaps he would listen to respected voices from the broader political community. She arranged a discreet meeting with Sir James Whitmore, a former prime minister who had maintained cordial relationships with the royal family and was known for his integrity and wisdom. The meeting took place at Whitmore's private estate, away from palace ears and royal protocol. Whitmore listened carefully as Isadora explained the situation, reviewing the financial documents and her findings about Morrison's investigation methods. His expression grew increasingly troubled as the full scope of what had happened became clear. Your Majesty, he said finally, what you're describing sounds less like a legitimate concern about misconduct and more like a deliberate campaign to remove your family from their positions of influence. But why would Morrison want to do that? What does he gain from destroying my family? Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. There are those within the traditional nobility who have never been comfortable with the influence your family has gained within the palace. Your brother's cultural programs have changed how the kingdom presents itself to the world, emphasizing accessibility and popular engagement over traditional aristocratic culture. Your sister's charity work has highlighted social issues that some would prefer to ignore. The implications of what he was saying hit Isadora like a physical blow. You're suggesting this is about class warfare? About traditional nobility reasserting control over the monarchy? I'm suggesting that power struggles within royal courts have often had less to do with competence or misconduct, and more to do with competing visions of what the monarchy should represent, Whitmore replied diplomatically. As Isadora drove back to the palace that night, she realized that her family had become casualties in a larger battle for the soul of the monarchy. The question was whether Edmund was an unwitting participant in this campaign or an active collaborator in it. Either way, she now understood that saving her family would require more than proving their innocence. It would require exposing a conspiracy that went to the heart of the royal establishment and challenging power structures that had existed for centuries. The quiet, supportive queen was about to become something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose, and the determination to fight for everything she held dear. The revelation that her family had been targeted as part of a larger power struggle changed everything for Isadora. She was no longer just fighting to save their positions in the palace. She was fighting against centuries of entrenched class privilege and political manipulation. The stakes had become much higher, and she realized she needed allies who could match the influence and resources of her opponents. Her first move was to reach out to Princess Catherine, Edmund's younger sister who had always maintained a complicated relationship with the traditional royal establishment. Catherine had shocked the court 15 years earlier by marrying a successful businessman rather than a titled nobleman, and she had often spoken privately about the need for the monarchy to modernize and become more relevant to ordinary citizens. The sisters-in-law met at Catherine's private residence in the countryside, away from the surveillance and politics of the palace. Catherine listened with growing anger as Isadora explained what she had discovered about Morrison's campaign against her family. "I knew something was wrong when Edmund started acting so strangely," Catherine said, pacing around her sitting room. "He's been different these past few weeks, more rigid, more suspicious of everyone around him. I thought it was stress from the upcoming trade negotiations, but this explains everything." "Do you think he knows what Morrison is really doing?" Isadora asked. "Or is he being manipulated just like everyone else?" Catherine stopped pacing and fixed Isadora with a serious look. "My brother is many things, but he's not stupid. If Morrison presented him with a compelling case against your family, Edmund would have demanded to see the evidence himself. The fact that he's refusing to show you anything suggests he knows the evidence is questionable at best." The possibility that Edmund was actively participating in the conspiracy against her family was almost too painful for Isadora to consider. But Catherine's assessment forced her to confront the likelihood that her husband had chosen political expedience over justice and power over love. "What can we do?" Isadora asked. "Morrison has the support of most of the royal council, and Edmund seems determined to go through with this banishment regardless of the consequences." Catherine smiled grimly. "We remind them that the monarchy exists at the pleasure of the people, not the other way around. Your family's work has made them genuinely popular with the public. Marcus's cultural programs have brought arts and heritage to communities that never had access before. Elena's charity work has touched thousands of families. If the people understood what was really happening here, there would be outrage." The idea of taking their fight public was both thrilling and terrifying. It would mean breaking the royal family's cardinal rule of never airing internal disputes in the media. But it might also be their only chance to save her family and expose the corruption that was poisoning the monarchy from within. Together, they developed a careful strategy. Rather than directly challenging the royal council's decision, they would highlight the positive impact that Marcus and Elena's work had on the kingdom. They would arrange for beneficiaries of their programs to speak publicly about what the royal family's support had meant to them. They would document the success stories and measurable improvements that had resulted from their efforts. The campaign began subtly, with Catherine arranging interviews with arts organizations that had flourished under Marcus's guidance. Local newspapers ran features on rural schools that had received library funding from Elena's literacy program. Television programs showcased the children's hospital renovations and the families who had been helped by royal charity initiatives. At first, the stories seemed like routine positive coverage of royal activities. But as more and more articles appeared highlighting the specific contributions of Marcus and Elena, a narrative began to emerge that would make their removal seem not just unfair but actively harmful to the kingdom's interests. Meanwhile, Isadora worked on a more personal front, reaching out to Edmund's longtime friends and mentors who might be able to influence his thinking. She contacted his former university professor, Dr. Harrison Blackwell, who had taught the constitutional law courses that had shaped Edmund's understanding of modern monarchy. Dr. Blackwell agreed to meet with Isadora, and their conversation revealed another troubling dimension to the situation. The elderly professor had noticed changes in Edmund's behavior and decision-making that concerned him from an academic perspective. "Your Majesty, the Edmund I taught was someone who believed deeply in evidence-based decision-making and collaborative leadership. The man who would banish family members based on unsubstantiated allegations is not the student I remember," Dr. Blackwell said with obvious concern. "What could cause such a dramatic change in someone's character?" Isadora asked. Pressure, he replied simply. The kind of sustained psychological pressure that comes from being told repeatedly that your judgment is flawed, that your natural instincts are wrong, that only certain advisors can be trusted to guide you correctly. The professor's assessment suggested that Edmund might be the victim of a sophisticated manipulation campaign designed to isolate him from independent voices and make him dependent on Morrison's counsel. If that was true, then saving her family might require saving her husband as well. As the public awareness campaign gained momentum, the palace began to take notice. Isadora started receiving pointed comments from staff members about the unusual amount of media attention her family's work was receiving. Lord Morrison requested a meeting with her, ostensibly to discuss coordination of royal public relations efforts. The meeting was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. Morrison never directly accused Isadora of orchestrating the media coverage, but he made it clear that he was aware of what she was doing and that he considered it a betrayal of royal protocol. Your Majesty, the monarchy has always maintained its dignity through discretion and internal unity, he said smoothly. When family disputes become public spectacles, it undermines the institution's authority and stability. Isadora met his gaze steadily. What undermines the institution's authority is making decisions based on politics rather than justice, Lord Morrison. The public attention my family is receiving reflects their genuine contributions to this kingdom, nothing more. Nevertheless, it would be unfortunate if this situation escalated to the point where more dramatic measures became necessary, Morrison replied, and the threat in his words was unmistakable. That evening, Isadora realized that her fight to save her family had reached a critical juncture. Morrison and his allies were preparing to escalate their campaign, possibly targeting her directly if she continued to resist their agenda. The question was whether she had built enough public support to withstand whatever they threw at her next. She also realized that time was running out. Her family had less than 3 days before they were supposed to leave the palace permanently. If she was going to stop this injustice, she needed to act decisively and soon. The woman who had once believed that quiet dignity and patient negotiation could solve any problem was about to discover whether she had the courage to risk everything in a final, desperate gambit to save the people she loved most. As she prepared for what might be the most important battle of her life, Isadora understood that she was fighting not just for her family, but for the kind of monarchy she wanted to leave to future generations. The outcome would determine whether the crown would serve the people or merely the privileged few who had always sought to control it. The final confrontation came sooner than Isadora had expected. On the morning that was supposed to be her family's last day in the palace, she woke to find Edmund's side of the bed not just empty, but clearly unslept in. When she went looking for him, she discovered that he had called an emergency meeting of the Royal Council at dawn, without informing her. The exclusion was deliberate and devastating. In their 15 years of marriage, Edmund had never held a significant meeting without at least informing her, even if she wasn't directly involved. This break with tradition could only mean that whatever was being discussed concerned her directly. Margaret found her an hour later with news that confirmed her worst fears. Your Majesty, I've heard rumors that the council meeting is about more than just your family's departure. There's talk of other changes to palace arrangements. The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise the implications. Morrison and his allies weren't content with removing her family. They were preparing to remove her influence as well. Perhaps they were even considering removing her entirely. Isadora made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just weeks earlier. She was going to confront the royal council directly, protocol be damned. The council chamber doors were guarded, but the guards couldn't legally prevent the queen from entering a room in her own palace. She pushed through their half-hearted protests and strode into the chamber where 6 men were seated around a massive oak table, with Edmund at the head looking more trapped than regal. The conversation stopped abruptly when she entered. Morrison's face flushed with anger at the interruption, while the other council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Edmund looked up at her with an expression she couldn't read. Fear, perhaps, or shame, or both. Gentlemen, Isadora said, her voice carrying all the authority of 15 years as queen, I understand you're making decisions about my family's future. As their advocate and as your queen, I believe I have a right to participate in this discussion. Morrison stood immediately. Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. Council meetings are not open to the queen? Isadora interrupted, taking a seat at the table without waiting for permission. How fascinating. I was under the impression that I was a partner in this monarchy, not merely a decorative accessory. The tension in the room was electric. Edmund still hadn't spoken, and his silence was more damning than any words could have been. The man who had once defended her right to participate in all aspects of royal decision-making was now sitting quietly, while his advisors treated her like an intruder. Treasury Secretary Hamilton cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, we understand this situation is personally difficult for you, but the Council's recommendations are based on careful analysis of potential risks to the Crown." Isadora reached into her briefcase and began spreading documents across the table. "Then, let's discuss those risks based on actual facts rather than manufactured accusations." For the next hour, she systematically dismantled every allegation against her family members. She presented financial records showing their scrupulous handling of palace funds, testimonials from beneficiaries of their programs, and evidence of the positive impact their work had on the kingdom's international reputation. Most damaging to Morrison's position, she revealed what she had learned about his investigation methods, the intimidation of staff members, the leading questions designed to elicit negative responses, and the complete absence of any credible evidence of actual wrongdoing. "Lord Morrison," she said finally, fixing him with a stare that could have melted steel, "you've orchestrated what can only be described as a witch hunt against my family. The question is why? What do you gain from destroying people whose only crime was being effective in roles you never wanted them to hold?" Morrison's composure finally cracked. "Your Majesty, your family's influence in this palace has grown far beyond what is appropriate for people of their background. The monarchy requires advisors who understand tradition, hierarchy, and the proper order of things." "The proper order of things," Isadora repeated slowly. "You mean an order where commoners know their place and don't presume to contribute meaningfully to royal responsibilities. I mean an order where the crown is protected from the kind of populist influences that have weakened monarchies throughout history." Morrison shot back, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic language. The mask was finally off. This wasn't about misconduct or competence. It was about class warfare and the old nobility's fear of losing their exclusive control over royal power. Isadora turned to Edmund, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange. "Is this what you believe? That my family's contributions to your kingdom are somehow threatening to your authority?" Edmund looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something break behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I believe anymore, Isadora. I've been told so many things, shown so much supposed evidence, that I can't tell what's real and what's manipulation." The admission was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Her husband, the man she had thought was strong enough to lead a nation, had allowed himself to be manipulated by advisors who cared more about maintaining their own power than serving the kingdom's interests. "Then, let me make it simple for you," Isadora said, standing up and gathering her documents. "You can choose to be the king who destroys innocent people based on lies and class prejudice, or you can choose to be the king who stands up to corruption and protects the people who have served you faithfully." She walked toward the door, then turned back for one final statement that would be remembered by everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. "If you proceed with this banishment, Edmund, you won't just be losing my family. You'll be losing me as well. I won't remain queen of a kingdom that treats good people this cruelly, and I won't stay married to a man who values political convenience over basic human decency." The ultimatum hung in the air as she left the chamber. She had played her final card, and now everything depended on whether Edmund had enough character left to do the right thing. The next few hours passed in agonizing suspense. Isadora waited in her chambers, packed bags standing by in case she needed to leave with her family. She had meant every word of her threat. She would abdicate her position and end her marriage rather than be complicit in this injustice. Just before sunset, there was a knock at her door. Edmund entered alone, looking older than she had ever seen him. He walked to where she sat by the window and knelt beside her chair, a gesture he hadn't made since their wedding day. "I've dismissed Morrison from the Royal Council," he said quietly. "Hamilton and Blackwood as well. I've asked your family to remain in their positions and offered them my personal apology for the unconscionable way they've been treated." Isadora felt tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't sure if they were from relief, grief, or exhaustion. "What changed your mind?" Edmund took her hands in his, and for the first time in weeks, his touch felt genuine. "You did. Watching you fight so bravely for people you love made me realize what I had become, a weak man who let others make him cruel. I remembered why I fell in love with you, and why your family became part of mine. The reconciliation wasn't immediate or complete. Trust, once broken, required time and effort to rebuild. But, as they held each other in the fading light of that terrible day, Isadora understood that they had both learned something valuable about the difference between royal power and true strength. Her family remained in the palace, their positions restored, and their contributions once again valued. The kingdom continued to benefit from Marcus's cultural vision and Elena's compassionate charity work. And Isadora had discovered that sometimes the most important duty of a queen is knowing when to risk everything to protect what matters most. The woman who had once believed that quiet submission was the price of wearing a crown had learned that true royalty sometimes requires the courage to roar.